How is your brother?
Brother?
Dr. Jekyll?
Oh, he hasn't been himself of late.
This movie has Jack the Ripper, Burke and Hare, and is trans. What's not to love? Hey, welcome back. I don't know who I'm talking to because I'm sat here on my own. So, do you want a coffee? I can't get you a coffee, but I can wait, or you can pause the video while you go and make yourself a coffee. Okay, so I want to do a little background to this video before we get into it proper, because this one's been a right pain to put together. In case you didn't know, both Hammer Horror, the studio whose name was once synonymous with the entire genre, and who swathes of the British public look back on as some kind of perfect encapsulation of a wonderful time when Britain was something, have recently been announced to be returning to filmmaking. The aptly named John Gore, a British theatre producer, has acquired the rights to Hammer Studios, and according to Variety, plans to invest significantly in Hammer films to breathe new life into the studio, blending the nostalgic charm of Hammer with modern cinematic style and innovation, while preserving its heritage and library. Now, initially this video began as a sort of history of Hammer and its main rival in filmmaking, Amicus Productions, because, well, as luck would have it, they're also making a return. Alongside Hammer's revival, independent filmmaker Laurie Brewster, the man behind the low-budget horror outfit Hex Horror, has collaborated with the family of Amicus Productions founder Milton Subotsky to revive the company with an upcoming anthology flick titled In the Grip of Terror. And you can actually support them in making that film happen by heading on over to their Kickstarter, to which I'll put a link in the description. Maybe one of my tens of followers would like to help them make that a reality. God knows none of you are helping me. I'm not bitter, I promise. The point is that while writing the script for that video, I realised that, well, no, that's way too big a topic and I'm not driven or clever enough to be able to put all of that into one video. I'd rather just lay on the sofa eating Pringles, drinking Monster and watching Only Murders in the Building. Anyway, with Hammer back, the first film to be released under Gore's ownership is set to be Dr. Jekyll, which stars comedian and actor Eddie Izzard in the title role. Now, Izzard does go by the name Susie, but she said that she's going to continue to use Eddie as a stage name because it has the brand recognition. So for the sake of clarity, I'll be referring to her as Eddie here, but I will be using she, her pronouns because I'm not a massive arsehole. Now, unsurprisingly, given that the general discourse of our day and age just seems to revolve around trans rights and trans people in general, the film has come under fire being labelled woke bullshit and a joke before, well, anyone's even actually seen it. Of course, it's worth noting here that Izzard herself has thrown her support behind old Queen Turf Rowling, telling The Telegraph, "I don't think J.K. Rowling is transphobic. I think we need to look at the things she has written about in her blog. Women have been through such hell over history. Trans people have been invisible too. I hate the idea that we are fighting between ourselves, but it's not going to be sorted out with the wave of a wand. I don't have all the answers, and if people disagree with me, fine, but why are we all going through hell on this?" And that's especially disappointing because she should know that a lot of the hate being directed toward the film, and indeed toward her, is in part spurred on by Rowling and her bigotry. Now, putting aside the ridiculousness of the fact that this is literally just a bunch of whiny man babies getting upset over the existence of a trans person in a movie, it also shows a rather bizarre lack of understanding about what Hammer was and what they were about, which is especially funny because a lot of these people claim to be fans. But the thing is, how do I put this? Well, this isn't the first Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde adaptation that Hammer have made. And, well, with that in mind, let's talk about Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. So, Hammer is back. And this matters to me because, well, as a budding film fan, they were one of the key figures. Figures? Is that the right term to refer to a studio? Figures. They were one of the main influences on my love of horror. I used to stay up late at night watching the films on the Beeb, and while I never hid behind the sofa because that's a really weird thing to do, what the hell's up with that, boomers? Speaking of which, why were people afraid to get in the bath after Jaws? There's no shark coming up your plug hole. How squishy do you think a shark is? Their lavish productions and melodramatic over-the-top approach to their material has long been something that I've, well, loved. I think it's fair to say that when we say Hammer, most people have a certain picture in their head, and this usually takes on the form of stereotypically gothic aesthetics, spooky castles, misty fog, cobwebs and shadows, with a sort of pulpy take on some literary source. Of course, their most well-known properties are probably the takes on both Frankenstein and Dracula, but throughout their heyday, the studio produced a whole host of horror flicks, from reworkings of iconic classics to noirish thrillers that sought to capitalise on the success of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. It's fair to say, I think, that at the height of their success, the studio was horror. As David Peary writes, the horror genre, as it has been developed in this country by Hammer and its rivals, remains the only staple cinematic myth which Britain can properly claim as its own, and which relates to it in the same way as the Western relates to the American. Yet, Hammer was massive, and not only did their work in the horror genre lead to their own success, it also inspired a string of imitators. Most notable among these were the aforementioned Amicus Productions, whose portmanteau films would carve out their own niche and be just as fondly remembered. But across the pond, Hammer's grip on the genre would inspire independent filmmaker Roger Corman to release a string of his own Hammer-esque flicks, a series of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations starring Vincent Price. And of course, while they would ultimately go into liquidation in 1979, the studio's name has lived on. There have even been prior attempts to reanimate the brand. In 2008, Hammer, under new ownership, released Beyond the Rave, a vampire flick which premiered via the social media site MySpace, as a series of 20 4-minute episodes before finally being released on DVD as a limited edition in 2010. MySpace. I was never in anyone's top friends list. Will the sympathy make you support me on Patreon? In 2009, the supernatural horror Wake Wood was released to relatively good reviews. It stars Aidan Gillen and Eva Burstall as a grieving couple who move to the small village of Wakewood, where they meet the mysterious Arthur, played by Timothy Spall, who claims that he can bring back the dead for 3 days. That same year, they produced a psychological thriller, The Resident, which would mark the return of Hammer icon Christopher Lee in his final appearance in a Hammer project. 2010 saw the release of Max Reeves' Let Me In, a remake of Thomas Alfredson's excellent 2008 vampire horror, Let the Right One In. And then, in 2012, they would release their biggest success under the revival, and also the biggest success that Hammer has ever had to date. James Watkins' take on the Susan Hill classic ghost story The Woman in Black stars a post-Harry Potter Daniel Radcliffe as a grieving lawyer who travels to the isolated Eel Marsh house, where he encounters the titular ghostly apparition. The film was pretty well received by both audiences and critics alike, and even got a sequel in 2014. That same year, they released the Jared Harris starring The Quiet Ones, about a professor who attempts to prove that ghosts are actually manifestations of the human psyche. Then, after several years of silence, in 2019 they would reappear again with the psychological thriller The Lodge, which is about a woman and her stepchildren who find themselves stranded in a rural lodge over Christmas. The film did well with critics, with Dennis Harvey of Variety writing, "The Lodge may be best taken on the same terms as 60s, early 70s Italian giallos, with their somewhat random manipulations of plot and character logic in service of atmospheric shocks. Genre homage does not appear to be an intention here, but the film is certainly at its best in fostering a sense of stylish dread and orchestrating some harrowing individual sequences." Despite this, however, the studio would all but disappear over the next few years until their aforementioned return was announced this year under the leadership of John Gore. The film being marketed as their grand return is, as I already said, Dr. Jekyll, an adaptation of the Robert Louis Stevenson novella The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Despite Dr. Jekyll being marketed as Hammer's grand return, the film was actually produced by Be Good Pictures, the production company owned by the movie's director, Joe Stevenson. Hammer acquired the distribution rights in 2022 and have now positioned it as their first flick under the new ownership. Izzard herself, of course, is actually no stranger to horror. Having begun her career as a stand-up comedian, the star has had a relatively successful acting career, appearing in everything from 2004's Ocean's 12 and its sequel, 2007's Ocean's 13, to perhaps, rather ironically, voicing Lord Voldemort in the 2017 Lego Batman movie. Of course, across her career, she has appeared in horror. She co-starred in the 2000 period piece Shadow of the Vampire, which reimagines the filming of 1922's Nosferatu, and she had a recurring role on Brian Fuller's Hannibal, in which she played Dr. Abel Gideon, an institutionalised killer who is led to believe that they are responsible for the murders carried out by that show's titular cannibal. Now, I've already pointed out the absurdity of all the whiny turf man babies losing it over the fact that a trans woman is appearing in a movie, but I'm going to point it out again because it's hilarious. What's that? Eddie Izzard's in a film? She's been in lots of films, some of them I've even liked. Ah! Now, not only is this just obviously a pathetic display of bigotry, but it's also kind of funny because it shows a lack of understanding of what Hammer is, and indeed what it was that made them so successful and so beloved in the first place. Hammer have always sought controversy in one way or another, and they also have a rather healthy reputation for pushing boundaries and being kind of progressive. And while that might seem like a slightly weird thing to say here in 2023, yeah, they were. So, without further ado, in 1957, a relatively small production company released a low-budget gothic horror movie based on Mary Shelley's seminal and influential 1818 sci-fi horror Frankenstein. And it's Hammer, you know it's Hammer. Starring British television star Peter Cushing as the infamous Dr. Frankenstein and a then relatively unknown Christopher Lee as his creation, Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein essentially kick-started a sort of classic horror revival, a renewed interest in gothic fiction, and directly led the studio down a path that would see the brand of Hammer become synonymous with the horror genre. And the team would reunite multiple times over the next decade and change, taking a stab at basically any classic monster that they could get their hands on. Werewolves, mummies, and, of course, Dracula became Hammer Studios' bread and butter, and while they would ultimately wind up falling behind the times when American horror cinema found its footing once more, there's no denying that Hammer's legacy is one that casts a long shadow over horror cinema even today. But for all the praise and recognition that gets heaped on the studio for their boobs and blood approach to classic horror cinema, reworking tales that had, at the time, become kind of old-fashioned, less is said about the way in which the filmmakers actually adapted these stories into the modern era. For example, it's easy to point to the opening sequence of 1958's Dracula, or Horror of Dracula as it was retitled for US audiences, in which the camera eerily tracks through a shadowy tomb before resting on the titular monster's name etched in stone, while brilliantly vibrant red blood, now in glorious Technicolor, splashes down on it as a prime instance of the studio's gory trend setting. What really gave Hammer their success, at least in my opinion, was that their films worked to engender progressive forms of ideological awareness through the utilisation of traditional generic cinematic structures as a method to subvert a conservative value system. And yeah, to put it simply, Hammer was kind of woke. Of course, if we're to hold the studio's output to today's social standards, we'll see them crumble dramatically. But during the time, Hammer's movies were legitimately progressive and fairly liberal in their attitudes and representations. And that might sound weird to say here in the year of our Lord 2023, but seriously, let's use the aforementioned Dracula as an example. Personally, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Dracula, though where and when I first heard of him is a mystery. Dracula is so ingrained in our cultural history that he was just sort of always there, and for me, in my childhood at least, that very much took the form of Christopher Lee's take on the blood-sucking Count. In fact, I was so aware of Lee's portrayal that I never really understood why people did the blood accent every time they did an impression of Dracula, and I remember seeing the 1931 Todd Browning film starring Bela Lugosi several years later, and being like, what the hell? Dracula doesn't talk like that. While Universal's 1931 take on Bram Stoker's iconic story, despite its many deviations from it, essentially doubles down on the novel's take, in which the Count represents evil, the unknown, and the threat of the foreign, In Hammer's film, adeptly brought to life by director Terence Fisher, Lee doesn't even bother with an accent, perhaps the most recognisable facet of Lugosi's performance, blurring the line between him and the stuffy old Brits he ultimately finds himself at war with. Instead of a mysterious and frightening foreigner, Lee presents his Dracula as equal parts charismatic and manipulative. A vicious puppet master, cool and collected all the way up until the moment that he isn't, when he abruptly and unexpectedly turns, becoming almost rabid and monstrously animalistic. In Hammer's then modernising of the classic tale, Dracula becomes a kind of parasitic and insidious aristocrat. He's Marx's vampiric vision of capitalism made flesh. Marx wrote that capital is dead labour, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labour, and lives the more labour it sucks. Hammer's Dracula literally feeds upon the lower classes, before later pouncing upon the British upper class, echoing Marx's assertion that its own colossal productivity would bring capitalism to its knees. Dracula, as seen in the 1958 film, is the literal manifestation of the idea that capitalism will ultimately end up eating itself. And then, of course, there are the women. Relegated to mere pawns in Todd Browning's 1931 classic, Hammer reshapes them as characters with agency. That's not to say that Hammer was all that progressive when it came to its depictions of women. After all, we are talking about a studio that was as infamous then as they are now for their scantily clad female leads. But they certainly brought more to the table on that front than many others before them, and this would go on to become key to the entire Hammer brand. Boobs and blood, as it were. The Curse of Frankenstein, for all its gory controversy, was still lacking in one key ingredient that many would consider integral to what makes a Hammer horror: sex. With Dracula, that not only changed, it was perhaps the filmmaker's main focus. Lee drew heavily on it in his performance. In an interview, he said of the character, he had also to have an erotic element about him. It's a mysterious matter, and has something to do with the physical appeal of a person who's draining your life. It's like being a sexual blood donor. Women are attracted to men for any of hundreds of reasons. One of them is a response to the demand to give oneself. And what greater evidence of giving is there than your blood flowing literally from your own bloodstream? It's the complete abandonment of a woman to the power of a man. Which is really all any of us want. The iconography that Hammer's Dracula brought to the vampire is undeniable. Unlike Lugosi's classic version, Lee's count has fangs, blood-red eyes, and hisses and growls animalistically just as often as he quips and charms his way through polite society. But for all the monstrous elements that Hammer plays with, what really stuck, in my opinion at least, wasn't the horror, it was the sex. Hammer's Dracula, for lack of a better term, is, well, sexy. Of course, vampires have long been linked to sex, but I think there's an argument to be made that it was Hammer's take on Dracula that was the first to bring that so overtly to the screen. The allure of Dracula in the Hammer movies becomes not so much the inescapable brainwashing of Lugosi's villainous vampire, but rather an inviting offer of sexual liberation. As Roman Butler puts it in his book, the act of biting is presented as a highly sexual moment, with the victims becoming paralysed, calm but excited both at the same time. Indeed, when Dracula finds Mina, played by the stunning Melissa Stripling, in her bedroom late in the film, the scene plays out like a seduction, made much more evocative in colour through the addition of Mina's deep red lipstick and an increased sense of her state of undress when flesh tones are held in contrast to her plain white nightdress. And it's a seduction that Mina ultimately willingly engages in. I mean, look at this and tell me it isn't a little bit sexy. I'm beginning to wonder that maybe I might be revealing too much about myself. Released on the cusp of the swinging 60s, it's perhaps no surprise that this resonated. Hammer's murderous count offers a sort of freedom from the stuffy pomposity of the human heroes. Lee, at least, certainly viewed the character that way.
And I had perhaps discovered something in the character which other people hadn't, or hadn't noticed, or hadn't decided to present, and that is that the character is heroic, erotic, and romantic.
What's more, in Hammer's world, it's not just Lee's count that becomes sexual and alluring, it's vampirism itself. The act of blood-sucking becomes a metaphor for the act of sex. Lee's count seduces women, and in turn they are freed from their own sexual repression. It's worth noting that once they do become vampires, they become sexual figures in their own right, seductive, alluring, and above all, liberated. This was likely the final piece of the Hammer puzzle, and with it the mythos was completed. Hammer, in all its sexual, violent, vibrant, gory glory, had truly arrived. Dracula was a smash hit. Film Bulletin wrote, "The same spine-chilling talents that fashioned last summer's redoubtable Curse of Frankenstein are throwing up more skulls and shadows with Horror of Dracula, a Hammer Films production, British, for universal release, which is just above the best of the recent spate of boogie boolers." And no, I don't know what a boogie booler is either. Just say horror film, you weirdo. While Vincent Canby, writing in Motion Picture Daily, said, "Hammer Films, the same British production unit which last year restored Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to its rightful place in the screen's chamber of horrors, has now even more successfully brought back the granddaddy of all vampires, Count Dracula. It's chillingly realistic in detail, and at times as gory as the law allows. The physical production is first-rate, including the settings, costumes, Eastman colour photography, and special effects." And it's in my opinion, at least, that this was the true key to Hammer's success. It was about taking these classic, old-fashioned, often conservative stories and twisting them into something that was more in line with the growing progressive social attitudes of the time. It was only when American cinema caught up with the progressiveness, and the gore, let's not forget the gore, that Hammer really started to lose their hold on the horror top spot. Still, their progressive attitude shouldn't be overlooked, and considering that all this took place in the late 50s through to the early 70s, they were pretty good at it too. But while their earlier output felt consistently ahead of the curve, as time wore on, there's no denying that the studio slowly began to fall behind. Arguably, it was Tobe Hooper's 1974 Nightmare the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that acted as the final death blow for Hammer. That movie's adept tackling of contemporary social and political issues, as well as the grim, grimy nature of the film itself, essentially left the British studio scratching their heads in bemusement. While some 20 years earlier they themselves had been the cool, hip new kids on the block, now they were the very same outdated, old-fashioned classics that their successes had been a direct response to. This led to a scramble behind the scenes as Hammer desperately tried to find new and innovative ways to shock the audience and to bring their unique and progressive takes on classic horror up to date. And this is all admittedly a very long-winded way of me explaining how we wound up with such a strange and peculiar oddity as Roy Ward Baker's 1971 entry into the Hammer horror canon, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. So, let's talk about it. It's a strange case, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. Get it? In terms of a trans reading, it's both incredibly problematic and negative in its representations of transness, and yet also a weirdly positive and surprisingly progressive take on such a complex and difficult issue. Now, I'm not sure how much credit we can give to the filmmakers here, really, because while it does strike a chord with me personally, it's also, incredibly outdated and absurd. I mean,
Jekyll having a sister like that? Never thought he had it in him.
had what in him? Being the brother to a woman that you find attractive? What are you talking about? The film's writer, Brian Clemens, was perhaps best known for, among other things, The Avengers, the British spy series, not the Marvel thing, and the anthology series Thriller, which ran from 1973 to 1976, which is a lot of fun but features its fair share of troublesome gender stereotypes, among, other things. So, yeah, I don't know how much credit I can reasonably heap on them for the more positive elements of Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, but I suppose following that logic, the same can also be said of the negative aspects too. As is almost always the case with horror movies, and movies in general for that matter, trans characters aren't necessarily trans characters. This can be confusing because so often film has a tendency to conflate any kind of gender issue with transness. As Austin H. Johnson puts it, the term trans is, by and large, used interchangeably, and essentially refers to individuals whose gender identities are incongruent. And this matters because, as I outlined in my Psycho video, audiences have a tendency to sort of conflate these things, just like the movies that present them do. While with Psycho we can clearly see that Norman Bates isn't trans, he is still coded trans regardless. Dr. Jekyll, played by Ralph Bates in Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, is a little more complex. And that's a little bit weird to say, because in the world of film, Hitchcock is generally considered to be far deeper and more academic than basically anything that Hammer threw out. Still, there's a question mark hanging over Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. Is Dr. Jekyll really a trans character? The film opens with the titular doctor recounting the events that led to the moment we meet him, fleeing the scene of a crime through the smoky London fog and writing his tale into a journal. As he does so, he says,
"This is the testament of Dr. Henry Jekyll, aged 30, male. Male. Male."
Which on the surface at least would suggest that this is how he sees himself. This is how he identifies. Dr. Jekyll is male and it's simply Hyde that is female. Except, well, as the film goes on, that's not entirely accurate. As we come to learn, this repetition is actually a sort of attempt to convince himself of his maleness. As Hyde grows more powerful, Jekyll finds himself struggling to keep hold, and in such becomes less and less certain of his own gender identity. He repeats male at himself, not as a chant of some certain truth, but as the desperate last gasp of a person who has had their very foundational understanding of gender ripped to shreds. If the question that hangs over Stevenson's original novella is which one of these is the true representation of the character, Jekyll or Hyde, then the question that hangs over Hammer's gender-swapped version of the story is which one of these is the true gender identity. And that's pretty wild for a movie that came out in 1971, isn't it? Is Dr. Jekyll male? I don't know, and as the film progresses, he himself begins to question this more and more. At the beginning of the film, he doesn't seem to have any interest in changing his gender, and any interest he does ultimately wind up having is entirely circumstantial. However, he does seem to embrace and then eventually desire to become the opposite sex, at least at certain key moments throughout the film. And, I mean, there always does need to be some kind of inciting incident. Moreover, he enjoys becoming female, and he toys with the social expectations that this gender swap brings with it. I'll get into all of this in more depth a little bit later, but for now, at the very least, there does definitely seem to be some sort of definitive transition. Indeed, the film even features a somewhat iconic transformation sequence, one that is superbly executed and still kind of baffles me as to how it was done. I want to say fake mirror, but it doesn't look like a fake mirror, so if anyone does know how this was done, can you let me know in the comments, please? Because I really want to know. The moment directly after said transformation sequence is also interesting in the whole is Jekyll trans or not debate. He, now as she, approaches the mirror to study her reflection. Upon discovering her breasts, there seems to be a sort of pleasure and titillation within herself as she touches them and observes them in the mirror. Later, after seducing the brother of Jekyll's love interest, Howard Spencer, played by the Australian film, stage and television actor Louis Fiander, Jekyll as Hyde gleefully muses out loud who will win in this twisted love triangle. There's a strange sort of pleasure drawn from the character's willingness to toy with gendered expectations, and in terms of sexual orientation, things are kept pretty vague as well. As Hyde, Jekyll is presented as traditionally feminine and heterosexual, and yet she is also presented as being demonstrably not these things, because, well, she's Jekyll. Jekyll, however, appears to be straight. At least, he never shows an interest in anyone other than women within the context of the film outside of the sequences in which he is Hyde. But it's also worth noting that his murderous tendencies are never really presented as being especially sexualized either. He kills women to take their hormones, not to prey on them in a sexual way. Although later in the flick, once he is forced to kill and hopefully appease Hyde, the killing then takes on a sexual form. And this is especially troubling for a couple of reasons, so we'll come back to this in a bit. Contrast this with Hyde, however, whose murders do take on a somewhat sexual element. Both the killing of Jekyll's colleague and the killing of a young woman. I mean, the woman gets stabbed to death through the neck and then the blood splurts out all over her boobs. Boobs and blood. Anyway, we will cover all of this in more detail later, but for now let's just focus on how these two identities present themselves. As Hyde, Jekyll is free to be with men, as Jekyll with women. Moreover, Just how this transition works is confusing and inconsistent. At some point, Jekyll and Hyde are presented as more of a single entity than, say, Norman Bates and Mother. Here, the transness really shines through. But then at other points, they're definitively presented as being two separate entities entirely. They don't appear to remember everything the other does, and they have their own distinct personalities and behaviours. And I suppose you could argue that there's an element of this that I do kind of relate to. Before I came out, I lacked any real confidence in myself, and after I came out, I became far more confident and far more self-assured. I mean, before I came out, there's no way I would have sat in front of a camera talking about these movies on YouTube, for example. But then I was still the same person as I am now, and that aspect doesn't entirely fit in. So, yeah, these are the pitfalls of having cis straight white men write queer characters without speaking to a single queer person. Aren't we lucky that we've moved on from that? Regardless of how you choose to read the character though, the simple fact remains that Jekyll and Hyde is coded trans. Like so many before and since, they are a character that falls into the ever-changing, ever-confusing ball of movie trans, which encompasses any and every character that, at some point or another, differs from their gender as assigned at birth. As I already said, whether the folks over at Hammer considered any of this when putting together the film is questionable, but ultimately their intention is irrelevant when it comes to readings of the film. Get over it. Jekyll is Hyde. Hyde is Jekyll. They are coded trans, and therefore, as far as the film and film audiences are concerned, they are trans. And there's little doubt, at least in my mind, that this was a purposeful attempt at modernising and updating a classic text for then contemporary audiences, and was also likely Hammer attempting to capitalise on a then growing awareness of the LGBTQ+ community. Hammer's niche was arguably in controversy. Whether this was by way of the softcore pornish nature of a lot of their movies, the excessive for the time violence and gore, boobs and blood, remember, or the somewhat progressive attitudes peppered throughout their takes on classic properties doesn't really matter. The point is controversy was the name of the game, and so I'd be willing to bet that they looked at the current climate of the time and picked something that they thought was guaranteed to get people talking. And in this respect, I think it's also probably worth noting that the movie was released not 2 years after the 1969 Stonewall riots, which is generally regarded as the origin of the contemporary GLBTQ rights movement, and in which transgender street queens played an instrumental role. Hey, pick-me's! Did you hear that? And so it's hard to believe that the queerness, if not the transness specifically, was not in some form in Hammer's eyeline when hunting for a new way to turn the story into something that would appeal to contemporary audiences. And this is why whiny man-babies losing it and lamenting the fact that Hammer have gone woke or whatever are kind of just outing themselves as idiots. I mean, seriously folks, do you honestly expect me to believe that classic Hammer wouldn't have leapt on the trans issue had it been a topic of discussion like it is today? I mean, come on. And to be fair to them, this kind of controversy-taking line of filmmaking worked. This isn't even the first time Hammer has tackled these kinds of themes. They've done it before, and it worked before. Speaking of which... Now, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde wasn't Hammer's first take on Stevenson's novella. They'd produced 2 others before. A sci-fi comedy called The Ugly Duckling in 1959, and the more straight horror film, The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll in 1960. But Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde is by and far the most notable and the most well known. While the other 2 films tend to play the actual Jekyll-Hyde transformation as in line with Stevenson's novella, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde finds a far more interesting and intriguing take. Considering how simple the actual gender swap take is, it suddenly opens the narrative up to a far broader, far more interesting interpretation. No longer is it merely an adaptation of a classic text, but rather, much like Hammer's other perhaps better recognised forays into the world of classic monsters, becomes a unique and inventive take on a recognisable and iconic character in its own right. The film itself was relatively positively received for the time of release, with Time Out calling it enormous fun and an admirably successful attempt to ring new changes on an old theme. While Variety noted that director Roy Ward Baker has set a good pace, built tension nicely, and played it straight so that all seems credible. He tops chills and gruesome murders with quite a lot of subtle fun. Bates and Beswick, strong, attractive personalities, bear a strange resemblance to each other, making the transformation entirely believable. Anyway, regardless of what you actually think of the film and what you think of the studio and the filmmakers that produced it, the fact remains that Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde can be read as a trans narrative. The film takes the core elements of Robert Louis Stevenson's original 1886 novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but, in typically Hammer-esque fashion, changes many of the aspects of the plot to update them. In Stevenson's novella, the reputable Dr. Henry Jekyll transforms into the murderous criminal named Edward Hyde after ingesting a mysterious chemical concoction in order to live out his darkest impulses. In the Hammer film, the reputable Dr. Henry Jekyll is an obsessive scientist trying to produce an elixir of life. His elixir requires female hormones to work, and so, while initially purchasing fresh cadavers from Burke and Hare... Oh yeah, Burke and Hare are in this. He begins killing women when he's unable to continue to get them, in a slew of murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. I forgot to mention the Jack the Ripper thing too. Yeah, this movie's wild. However, the serum has the unexpected side effect of changing Dr. Jekyll's sex, transforming him into the beautiful Martine Beswick. As was noted by Trace Thurman, the gender swapping aspect of the film calls to mind the current trend of gender swapping we're seeing in major franchises today, like Ghostbusters 2016, Ocean's 8 2018, and possibly future 007 films. And much like Trace, I can't help but wonder what the response to this kind of shake-up of the narrative would have been had the internet existed in 1971. I mean, Jesus, can you imagine? Hammer's decision to embed this aspect into its latest classic monster adaptation is a curious one, but it also seems to be in keeping, at least in certain respects, with the spirit of the original novella. As already outlined, Hyde's presence is not that of a second entity, separated from Jekyll by way of Bates and Mother, but is rather an extension of Jekyll himself. His darkest impulses made flesh, an opportunity for the buttoned-up and repressed Dr. Jekyll to cast off the shackles of Victorian society and indulge in his most murderous and villainous impulses. It falls heavily in line with the Victorian beliefs of purity and deviance, which, as O.B. Mendingler puts it, they propelled to new highs and even more extreme lows, especially within a single soul. After placing those pure parts on pedestals, they then tried to stamp out all that was evil. In doing so, the Victorians created a new duality within themselves, but that duality was out of balance. Much has been made of how authors of the time, especially horror authors, utilised their macabre and sinister tales in order to explore the infamous Victorian repression of the times, and Stevenson's novella is a perfect example of that. This is a trend that passed over into film as well. Of course, Hammer is no stranger to the Victorian sexual repression, and it is often explored, challenged, or outright blown to smithereens by their increasingly titillating and sexual output. By the time we reach Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, Hammer has entered into the realm of full frontal nudity in their ever-growing quest for relevance and controversy. And in fact, the studio even struggled to fill the role of Hyde because it required nudity. And the subtextual elements of the classic story's exploration of sexual repression becomes full-blown text. But this desire to undress social sexual repression had grown beyond the realms of the period-set Gothic horror of the likes Hammer was adept at and seeded its way into mainstream cinema. In his essay Psychoanalysis of Psycho, Robin Wood comments on the use of imagery that is reminiscent of Victorian Gothic horror throughout that movie, and it's not alone. 1960s Peeping Tom would also explore an idea in a similar vein to Psycho, while Hammer was busy diving into it head first with their Karnstein trilogy, a trio of lesbian vampire films that I'll come back to a little later. What is interesting about Stevenson's novella, though, is the way in which the exploration of sexual repression so easily translates to a queer reading of the text. Stevenson's own sexuality has often been called into question. A series of letters between Stevenson and Peter Pan author J.M. Barrie seems to hint at a romantic attraction between the two men. According to The Guardian, the letters were written in 1892, and Stevenson died 2 years later, but there's little denying that the relationship was somewhat homoerotic, especially given Barrie himself wrote to Stevenson saying, "To be blunt, I have discovered, have suspected for some time, that I love you, and if you had been a woman..." Whatever Stevens' sexuality actually was, the original novella regardless has often been read as having inherently queer undertones, which alternately mediate, contain and express the homosexual tendencies and desires of a queer coterie of professional men occupying the novel's centre. And by gender swapping the character of Hyde, what Hammer do is inadvertently shift that reading entirely into the realms of a trans one. It's not hard to see where the trans reading comes from, really. But what I think is truly interesting is the way in which the movie deals with the whole transformation. Jekyll dubs his female self Edwina Hyde, and while initially he is curious but put off by this unexpected side effect, he seemingly slowly begins to desire becoming Hyde, even going so far as to sort of excitedly purchase corsets for her. Of course, the fact that Jekyll seems to enjoy being a woman, at least in the earlier parts of the narrative, is key to our reading here. But what's especially interesting is the fact that Hyde herself is presented as being a far more open, far more liberated, far more free character than the repressed and buttoned-up Dr. Jekyll. As Joe Lipsett writes, although Hyde is hardly an agent for good, her spirit is adventurous, daring and boundary-pushing. Here is a film that is only truly liberated and living deliciously when a woman seizes power from men. It's almost a disarmingly positive depiction, especially for the time. While most horror movies featuring some kind of transcoded character will lean into the psychological torment of gender confusion, often using it as a motive for monstrous and murderous behaviours. And yes, I am throwing shade at De Palma's Dressed to Kill yet again, which is also, weirdly enough, the name of Eddie Izzard's 1999 stand-up. Hammer instead presents it as a liberating and freeing experience for Jekyll, at least at first. And it's also important to note, I think, that while this wasn't the first adaptation of Stevenson's original novella that Hammer had produced, it also wasn't the first time that they'd explored the themes of gender either. No, they'd actually done that 4 years earlier with the fourth entry into their highly successful Frankenstein series. So let's pause for a moment and talk about that. Do you remember when The Sun ran that story about how woke snowflakes were claiming that Frankenstein's monster was actually the real victim all the time? Yeah, anyway, before they earned their reputation as the Boobs and Blood studio, Hammer Films made a solid, albeit unremarkable, living out of low-budget big-screen adaptations of radio plays and TV specials. However, the studio lucked into success with a feature film adaptation of writer Nigel Kneale's The Quatermass Experiment in 1955. Which they retitled the Quatermass Experiment in order to capitalise on the new X certificate. With Quatermass earning decent returns at the box office, Hammer found themselves seeking yet more horror properties to replicate their success. While their initial attempt secured relatively decent results, 1956's X the Unknown, which began as a Quatermass sequel before Kneale refused to allow the studio to use the character in a work that wasn't his own, and 1957's Quatermass 2, the studio really hit the big time with their 1957 Technicolor outing, The Curse of Frankenstein. Based on Mary Shelley's seminal 1818 novel, Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein sees Peter Cushing take on the role of the iconic mad scientist as he delves ever further and further into morally questionable depths in his quest to create life. Christopher Lee appears in the film alongside Cushing as Frankenstein's creation, who is violent and unpredictable, thanks to the good doctor's chosen brain having been damaged in a skirmish. It's really hard to understate Hammer's influence on horror. For a period, they were synonymous with the genre, and all of that begins with Frankenstein. Now, there's nothing inherently queer about the first three entries into Hammer's Frankenstein canon, at least other than the obvious. Frankenstein as a text is inherently queer anyway. As George Haggerty writes, masculine birth, lurid devotion between males, sexual aggression, and finally a completely obsessive relation between the scientist and the violent other he has created. There is nothing normative about the relation between Frankenstein and his creature. The almost by definition dysfunctional family relations are transgressive from the start, and as various feminist critics have argued, Frankenstein sacrifices the domestic in an egotistical urge toward creativity. He gives birth to the monster as a mockery of motherhood and the pain associated with giving birth. But don't worry, TERFs, Hammer didn't show much interest in this particular reading, at least not to begin with. For their take, Hammer turned to Jimmy Sangster, the man who had written the screenplay for X the Unknown, to produce a script for what would become their version of the classic horror story. While the story itself was in the public domain, Universal held the copyright to certain key elements of their version, including the image of Karloff's interpretation of the monster. And because of this, Sangster had to try and find a new way to approach the source material, and also, of course, keep it in line with the budgetary restrictions. So, much like the studio had done with Quatermass before it, they opted to really hone in on the horror. If there was any doubt that the studio sought out controversy here, then let it be cast aside now, because they were told that the movie was controversial even at a script stage. When Sangster submitted his draft to the BBFC, the report that came back told them, "We are concerned about the flavour of this script, which, in its preoccupation with horror and gruesome detail, goes far beyond what we are accustomed to allow even for the X category. I am afraid we can give no assurances that we should be able to pass a film based on the present script, and a revised script should be sent to us for our comments, in which the overall unpleasantness should be mitigated. But regardless of this, the studio proceeded with the script unaltered. Censorship, I guess. It doesn't get more punk than Hammer. It's hard now to understand just what was so shocking about it all. Here in the early 2020s, these things look rather quaint. But make no mistake, the flick was shocking to audiences at the time, and the most shocking aspect was, undoubtedly, the gore. Made with a crude film processing method called Kodak Eastman Color, the film was vibrant and vivid. As Marcus Harms writes, the process made up for its cheapness by giving the director and cinematographer a range of startling and vivid hues, especially red. The Curse of Frankenstein revels in its redness, from liquids in chemical flasks to the red of the berries in the forest near the Frankenstein chateau. And most horrifyingly of all, the creature's red eye after it has been shot in the face. Of course, Hammer would go on to break all kinds of boundaries when it came to gore. Kensington gore, a specific type of theatrical blood that the studio used, became integral to their entire brand. For me, though, the bloody violence is only one part of what made Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein so popular with audiences of the time, and what would go on to make their films moving forward such beloved and influential classics. Perhaps the most important aspect that Sangster brought to the story, in my opinion at least, is the focus on the Baron Frankenstein himself. Played in Hammer's version by the iconic Peter Cushing, Baron Frankenstein here is a villain. What makes Hammer's Frankenstein films especially brilliant is the fact that they lean heavily into the idea that it is Frankenstein, not his creations, that are the true antagonists of the series. For Hammer, Baron Frankenstein is a murderous, selfish and sinister character who will stop at nothing to make sure his experiments are successful. For Sangster, this aspect seemed obvious, as the writer himself put it.
Yes, but he is the villain. I mean, it's logical, isn't it, that he should be the villain. He's responsible for the whole thing, not this poor slob lying on that slab.
And it's this emphasis on the Baron as the true monster that I think made Hammer's Frankenstein really resonate. Unlike the Universal movies, where it is the monster itself that acts as the connective tissue, Hammer's films shift the focus entirely onto Cushing's Baron, who appears in every film in the series bar one, the more comedic The Horror of Frankenstein, which acts as a tongue-in-cheek remake of the original Curse. Hey look, Ralph Bates, from the other thing. It's continuity. Yay! The Curse of Frankenstein ends with the titular doctor in custody, having been found guilty of his crimes, and we watch as he is led solemnly to the guillotine. After The Curse of Frankenstein's surprise success, Hammer released a sequel the following year. 1958's The Revenge of Frankenstein picks up directly where Curse left off, with the villainous doctor escaping the guillotine with the help of a hunchback, named, disappointingly, Carl.
You're the doctor? Oh, no!
The action then jumps forward 3 years, where we find Cushing's Baron Frankenstein continuing his experiments, this time planning to transplant a living brain into a fresh cadaver. Enticed by the prospect of gaining a healthy body, Carl volunteers his brain for the procedure, but when he escapes the lab and becomes violent, Frankenstein and a fellow doctor named Hans must track him down before he wreaks havoc. The film ends with Frankenstein having his true identity revealed by a dying Carl to a band of murderous villagers. He's killed, and then later Hans transplants his brain into a new body, and the pair head off to London. 1964's streetcrawl, The Evil of Frankenstein, catches up with our protagonist and Hans as they travel to Frankenstein's homeland of Karlstad, with a plan to sell the valuables in the now abandoned Frankenstein chateau to fund their experiments. However, when they arrive, they find the valuables have been stolen, and are then forced to flee when the authorities recognise Frankenstein and attempt to arrest him. While hiding out in a cave, the duo discover Frankenstein's original creation, this time played by a wrestler named Kiwi Kingston, frozen in ice. Frankenstein thaws the creature and enlists the help of a shady hypnotist named Zoltan, who has been banished from Karlstad for performing without a license. However, Zoltan has his own motives, and uses the creature, which responds only to his command, to enact revenge upon the authorities. When Frankenstein attempts to stop Zoltan's rampage, the hypnotist orders the creature to kill the doctor, but the creature kills Zoltan instead, before erupting into a fit of rage and burning the laboratory to the ground with both he and Frankenstein inside. Oh, and also this. I love these movies. And hilariously, there's absolutely no reason for you to know absolutely any of this when it comes to the 4th entry, Frankenstein Created Women, because, well, the continuity just kind of gets thrown out the door.
Why can't they leave me alone?
The film offers up very little by way of explanation as to how the good doctor survived his fiery tumble, and even recurring characters, such as Frankenstein's assistant Hans, are played by entirely new actors and given completely new backstories. In fact, the film itself establishes everything you actually need to know, with the same kind of professional workmanlike scripting and delivery that Hammer movies were always particularly good at. There's seldom any flab or any excursions into pointless subplots with Hammer movies. But anyway, it's Frankenstein Created Women that I really want to talk about, so... Frankenstein Created Women was written by Anthony Hines, working under the pseudonym John Alder, and he was the son of Hammer's original founder, William Hines. Before Frankenstein Created Women, Hines had worked uncredited on scripts for 1960s Dracula sequel The Brides of Dracula, while writing, again under the pseudonym of John Alder, the screenplays for The Curse of the Werewolf in 1961, Night of the Creatures and The Phantom of the Opera in 1962, 1963's Kiss of the Vampire, 1964's The Evil of Frankenstein, and both The Reptile and Rasputin the Mad Monk in 1966. Hines' original script for Frankenstein Created Women had been intended to act as a follow-up for Revenge of Frankenstein, which perhaps goes some way to explaining the muddled continuity, in part in an effort to capitalise on the then popular French drama And God Created Women, directed by French filmmaker Roger Vadim. Indeed, the movie's original title was to be And Then Frankenstein Created Woman, but it was shelved in favour of a story synopsis by Peter Bryan, which had been submitted for the aborted television series Tales of Frankenstein. Given our current obsession with ongoing franchises like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the lack of care for continuity here could be a shock to some, or even viewed as a flaw when looking at it through a modern lens. But the truth is, Hammer never cared about continuity really, which kind of makes it funny when you consider all of the sequels that they produced. Interestingly, the concept of a cinematic universe is something of a horror film creation, with the original Universal classic monsters often crossing over in flicks such as 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and 1944's House of Dracula, but they never really bothered with continuity anyway either. So, continuity is not filmmaking, guys, who cares? Alongside its disregard for continuity, Frankenstein Created Women also shifts the focus of the series somewhat. Here, instead of trying to reanimate the physical components of a dead body, Cushing's Baron Frankenstein is preoccupied with the metaphysical, crafting a machine that he believes can capture a human soul in stasis, and then place that soul into a different body. And it's this element of the flick that filmmaker Martin Scorsese singled out when he listed it among his favourite flicks, saying, "If I single this one out, it's because here they actually isolate the soul. The implied metaphysics are close to something sublime." When his assistant Hans is wrongfully tried and found guilty of murder, the Baron, in typically self-obsessed and morally questionable fashion, seizes his opportunity and captures Hans's soul. As luck would have it, the local innkeeper's daughter has recently committed a disfigured and partly paralysed young girl named Christina, played by German-Austrian actress and model Susan Denberg. The good doctor sets about transporting Hans's soul into her body. Unbeknownst to the Baron, however, Hans and Christina were secret lovers, and it was in an effort to protect her that Hans had refused to provide an alibi for the murder he was found guilty of. And it was in distraught grief over Hans's death that Christina had killed herself. Over several months, Frankenstein and the bumbling and nervous Dr. Hertz treat Christina's deformity and disability, resulting in her becoming a typically attractive and inexplicably now blonde Hammer girl who apparently retains absolutely no memories of her former life, either as Christina or Hans. She does, however, begin to express a certain level of confusion and uncertainty around her identity, and this is something that she repeatedly asks both Frankenstein and Hertz about throughout the film, although neither of them are willing to give a truthful answer. Of course, this is a horror movie, and a Hammer one at that, so things don't stay smooth for long. Soon, Christina finds herself effectively possessed by the spirit of Hans, and is driven to enact revenge upon a trio of men who were actually responsible for the murder. To do this, Hans and Christina use their newfound beauty and femininity to seduce the men before killing them. Because, of course they do. Men using femininity as a mask and all that. While the Baron, having realised that Hans has taken control, rushes to stop the killing, he arrives too late and instead finds Christina with the severed head of her final victim in her hands. Frankenstein pleads with Christina as she heads toward the nearby lake to kill herself once more, offering her an answer to the question she is so often asked.
Now listen to what I have to say. It wasn't you who killed those young men. You didn't know what you were doing. Let me tell you who you really are.
However, Christina declines the offer, saying,
I know who I am
Please.
and what I have to do. Forgive me.
Christina!
Dark stuff, right? And you thought it was all quaint little villages and tea-sipping Downton Abbey pomposity. Of course, there's a fairly obvious transgender reading here, as I'm sure you've already noticed. I mean, the film quite literally deals with a man's essence or soul being transplanted into a woman's body, so I don't think it's much of a stretch to take the narrative and filter it through a transcentric lens. Frankenstein's soul-holding machine is described by the characters as trapping the soul, while Christina's confusion around her identity after Hans's soul has been transplanted into her rings true too. Her repeatedly asking the question, who am I, is something that I myself did a lot when I was younger, even before I had the context or understanding to really get what it was that I was experiencing. In this sense, the film spoke to me on a deeper level when I first saw it, and I identified in a strange way with Christina and her plight. Or perhaps that's Hans's plight. The film is iffy on who is actually in control at any given time, but, what do we want? This is the 60s. It's fair to say, though, that I do understand the pain of feeling like I didn't know myself or recognise my own body. Frustratingly, though, like so many of these movies, Frankenstein Created Woman is yet another film where we see a trans-coded character go on a violent and murderous killing spree. And here we find an especially troubling reading. After Frankenstein and Hertz cure Christina of her deformity and disability, she becomes stereotypically beautiful, with director Terence Fisher even shooting her in a more flattering light, which Hans, or Christina, then use to their advantage, seducing soon-to-be victims into letting down their guard with sexual advances before brutally slaughtering them. We're essentially hitting all the typical transphobic talking points here. There's a man appropriating a woman's body, he's using that body and the social expectations that come with it to harm people, and then ultimately the tables are turned on them. But where Frankenstein Created Woman diverts is in the fact that in this case, the killer isn't a man in a dress, but rather a masculine mind inside a biologically female body. And because of this, unlike, say, Norman Bates' mother, who, when he adopts the mother personality, must slink around in the shadows and sneak up on unsuspecting women in the shower, Hans and Christina don't have any such problem. They're able to get up close and personal with their prey, not only hinting at promises of sexual activity, but actually going so far as to grope and kiss and touch their victims in order to get them to drop their guard. And do I really need to cite a source to say why this is icky? Okay, fine, I will. As Ruth Pierce writes, the cultural positioning of trans women as dangerous to cis women relies on gendered conceptualizations of cis, implicitly white, women as necessarily fragile in relation to cis men, who in turn are conceptualized as having superior physical and sexual prowess. The way Hans and Christina prey upon their victims is to weaponize their supposed fragility in relation to the cis men. And in this sense, it very much plays into the idea of trans women being predatory men appropriating women's bodies for their own nefarious ends. It's also worth noting, I suppose, that Hans is effectively possessing Christina, thereby robbing her of her own agency and free will, in order to enact his bloody vengeance, taking the notion of trans women appropriating female bodies to its logical extreme. Here, the man isn't just appropriating the body, he's forcibly taking control of it. To call this troubling is an understatement. There's something oh so very turfy about all of this, and what that is exactly should at this point be fairly obvious. But there's another element to Frankenstein Created Woman that I think is especially interesting, and that's to do with the character of Frankenstein himself. Oftentimes, we will see anti-trans rhetoric turn up against doctors and specialists who help trans people with their care. This usually takes the form of claims that such medical professionals are pushing a so-called gender ideology, whereby they are manipulating impressionable young people and confused adults into signing up for treatments that they simply don't need. And I have seen words as horrible as abomination and freak used to describe myself, my fellow trans people, and indeed the doctors who offer gender-affirming care. Frankenstein's reputation throughout the Hammer series is one of a man playing with unnatural forces, going against the will of God, and generally just using science to get up to no good. This is fairly in line with the themes of Shelley's original novel, which bears the subtitle The Modern Prometheus, and delves quite heavily into the particular ideas of science as an affront to nature. And because of this, there are elements of those themes that carry themselves throughout Hammer's Frankenstein films, made even more overt by the fact that the films themselves focus primarily on the Doctor as the connective tissue. And when we look at them through a trans reading, that becomes an issue. It appears to feed into a lot of anti-trans rhetoric directed at trans-inclusive medical professionals and gender specialists. In effect, Frankenstein's position as the original mad scientist by default places any surgeon or doctor that has carried out often life-saving treatment on trans folk within that bracket. So, although the film does have its positives, the whole thing, when we start looking at it, becomes incredibly troubling and problematic. Although it's nothing when compared to Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. Oh boy, is it nothing. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde sits near the end of Hammer's dominance over the genre, and there are elements of the film that can be seen as an attempt to rejuvenate their formula. They had even begun to look at branching away from horror films once more, adapting a string of television sitcoms into relatively successful cinema outings, most notably the On the Buses series, alongside films like 1973's Love Thy Neighbour and 1974's Man About the House. But truthfully, these were kind of outdated and old-fashioned even at the time of their release. While they may have recouped the studio's spending, they hardly set the world on fire in a way that was even comparable to their successes with horror. Hammer had oversaturated the market. Between 1970 and 1974, the studio released 20 horror movies, and most of them very much within the formula of what the studio had already carefully repeated before. And while there are shades of their more classic output peppered throughout Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, the period setting, the classic literary source, the gothic atmosphere, and the lavish production design, there are undeniably aspects of it that saw the studio attempting to breathe new life into the material in a way that they had done before. Most notably here, of course, is the way in which the film plays with gender. If the studio's most iconic outing were to be Dracula, and their most important addition to that story is the sex, then it seems to me that this was something that they were hoping to emulate here. Sex is also kind of key to Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, not just in terms of the gender aspects, but in terms of it sort of just being kind of sexy. And Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde is kind of sexy. Now, as I've already said, whether or not you see Jekyll and Hyde as two separate characters or one single one is kind of up for debate, and the movie jumps back and forth on this too. And truthfully, there's part of me that just wants to sort of throw my hands in the air and go, well, the movie doesn't care, so why should we? But here's the thing, I don't think Jekyll or Hyde know the answer to that either. The movie has a lot of fun revelling in the wild freedom that Hyde brings to proceedings, and I'll echo the horror queer sentiments here once again, and say that the biggest issue I have with the film is that she's simply not in it enough. It's a shame because the middle section of the film, which sees Hyde embracing herself and buying herself extravagant dresses, is arguably the bit with the most potential. Jekyll getting pissed over the dress that Hyde bought is all kinds of relatable, and there is a kind of anticipatory excitement that he seems to have over the idea that he knows that he gets to explore this person a little more. Clemens and Barker are smart enough to not play things too seriously as well, and so the entire film has a sort of lightness and silliness to it that really captures the excitement of Hyde discovering herself. As a trans narrative, it's this section that reels the most positive readings too. Indeed, I myself have been through a similar sort of phase of discovery, and perhaps that's why I warm to it so much. Excitedly learning about the things that you always wished you could do, realising that suddenly you don't have to be bound by the patriarchal constructs of gender and the rules that they enforce on them, is legitimately freeing. And I think there's an element of the flick in these moments that really does sort of capture that. Moreover, Hyde's sort of femme fatale status is at its most playful and least insidious here. She toys with everyone, including Jekyll, and takes great pleasure in doing so. The juxtaposition between Jekyll and Hyde really adds to the more positive readings as well. Hyde's refusal to submit to Jekyll's buttoned-down, repressive lifestyle echoes the feelings of embracing one's true gender and exploring themselves as they are truly meant to be. There are arguments to be made that there are elements of Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde that could be read as a kind of metaphor for the entire trans experience. Learning to deal with one's own dysphoria can be hard, and Jekyll initially is reluctant to embrace the fact that he seems to enjoy it when Hyde takes control and leads him on a journey of self-discovery. Take Jekyll's relationship with Susan, for example. Susan lives upstairs and she seems to desire Jekyll romantically. Jekyll, however, would rather throw himself into his work and continuously misses and ignores her advances. He desires her too, which is made explicitly clear late in the film, but he is too repressed and too focused on his projects to engage her in a relationship. Counter this, though, with Hyde. Hyde seduces Howard almost immediately, taking exactly what she wants regardless of societal norms. It is through her that Jekyll can be unshackled and free to live a life of pleasure and enjoyment. It's important to note that this is what Jekyll wants, and he willingly transforms again and again before Hyde eventually develops the power to come out on her own. And this too feels very apt for our trans reading. Transitioning can be scary, as can coming out, and it often begins with little steps. Initially, one will make strategic decisions regarding the enactment of gender and gender identity disclosure based on specific social contexts, before then fully embracing who they are and allowing that identity to, take over. There's an argument to be made here as well that Jekyll's use of the serum to transform himself into Hyde is a stand-in for hormone replacement therapy. After all, HRT involves ingesting the hormones that correspond with one's true gender identity, while blocking the hormones of the gender as assigned at birth. A key plot point of the film is the fact that Jekyll's serum requires estrogen in order to work, hence his, and then later Hyde's, murderous late-night activities. Furthermore, the way Hyde slowly grows in strength the more Jekyll takes of the serum parallels the way HRT slowly enables a person to better outwardly resemble the gender that they identify with. And it's worth noting here too that this experience isn't exclusive to trans people. Cis people also sometimes take hormone therapy. Deal with it. Admittedly, though, this reading then does also throw up some rather troubling implications. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that Jekyll and Hyde are murdering women in order to obtain the estrogen for their serum. In a sense, this is a variation on a theme seen again in Jonathan Demme's 1991 Oscar-winning horror movie, The Silence of the Lambs, in which Buffalo Bill kidnaps and murders young women in order to create a flesh suit that will, in their minds, enable them to become the woman that they see themselves as. Like The Silence of the Lambs, the inclusion of this facet in Hammer's Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde plays into that most insidious and harmful of cinematic trans stereotypes, the trans as killer trope. Jekyll and Hyde's murderous activities are intrinsically linked to their transness, and while the motive here isn't as simplistic as something like The Silence of the Lambs or Dressed to Kill, in which the killer is simply a killer because they're trans, it can still be read that way to a certain degree. Jekyll needs estrogen so that he can transform, and so in simplistic terms, he kills in order to become a woman. This problematic element of the film feeds deeply into the idea that trans folk are somehow stealing or hijacking femininity as a means to disguise themselves or use said femininity as a way to attack cis women. As Ruth Pierce writes, trans women have long been positioned as a threat to cis women's safety, especially in Western societies, because trans women's bodies have been discursively associated with dangerous male sexuality and potential sexual predation. The fact that Jekyll and Hyde specifically murder women in order to get their estrogen positions them and trans people very much in the anti-women camp. Jekyll views his victims as little more than a means to an end for his own goals, and since that goal is A, to become a woman himself, and B, actively harming cis women, then it's hard to deny that there are troublesome elements buried away inside Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde's trans narrative. Moreover, the film emphasises the traditionally masculine elements of Jekyll's characterisation. He is heterosexual, for example, and as such is attracted to women, despite the fact that Hyde sleeps with men. We see this both in terms of his relationship with Susan and in the sequence directly after the first transformation, in which Hyde stands in front of the mirror and excitedly plays with herself. When he locks himself away for days working on his experiments, he grows stubble. At one point, Hyde fears being outed as Jekyll when her hands begin to transform back into hairy man hands. Man hands. That bit always feels a little bit, I don't know, there's something kind of transvestigation about it all. Ew. The hand comes back into play later when Jekyll prevents Hyde from killing, something that further muddies the relationship between the two and how the film views them. All of this positions Jekyll as masculine within the narrative of the film, and while Hyde certainly displays traditionally feminine traits, she's attracted to men, she likes extravagant shopping sprees. As outlined earlier, for the most part the film clearly also depicts Hyde as an extension of Jekyll, not a separate entity in her own right. And with this in mind, we can draw the conclusion that actually the film kind of portrays both Jekyll and Hyde as predominantly male-coded characters. And this means that any act that they carry out within the film, and most importantly for this point, their murderous tendencies, are also coded male acts. Jekyll and Hyde are a man preying on women, which only further emboldens the anti-trans rhetoric we hear so often from self-proclaimed gender-critical so-called feminists. It's an odd element in a film that is unusually more oddly overwhelmingly positive in its trans depiction, but it's one that cannot be ignored. There's also a bit where a policeman sort of insists that he's got the magical I can always tell gene that GC so often claim to have.
It was a woman, I saw her shape clearly. I'm no bloody Lothario, but I can tell a woman when I see one. Look, there she goes again.
Ah. And the fact that it's a copper making this claim is also kind of hilarious. Am I supposed to be surprised that police officers are morons? The film almost seems to go out of its way to position Hyde, the feminine side of Jekyll's own personality, as entirely threatening to women. Hyde shows absolutely zero romantic or sexual attraction to women, and yet she is a constant danger to them. When Susan discovers Hyde and her brother Howard in foreplay, Hyde quickly turns sinister, threatening Susan, and she murders women in the hunt for estrogen. She also ultimately plans to kill Susan in order to fully transform and become the dominating presence in Jekyll's body. Somewhat unusual aspects to all of this is the decision to play Hyde as entirely straight. Given Hammer's quest for controversy, you might be forgiven for thinking that the inclusion of a lesbian subtext might have helped in the hunt for relevance and success. And, well, yeah, I suspect that's what a lot of people would assume. It seems to me an obvious line for the studio to take, because if they're not actually talking to queer people when they're making these movies, then this is a straight cis person's idea of a straight cis person's idea of what it would be like to swap genders for a bit. But I suppose depending on the gender that Hyde and Jekyll are presenting as at any given moment, they tend to just sort of fall into the heteronormative roles there. And this extends to their love interests, which of course throws up all kinds of questions about the queerness of the characters in general. This flick is ripe for a remake, really, isn't it? Had Hammer inserted a lesbian element to the character's sexuality, then it certainly would have added to the reading. As it stands, though, in having the characters fit rigidly into these gender stereotypes, then Hyde's sexuality most definitely raises questions about Jekyll's. And it's worth noting that this isn't the only way in which the film throws up these ideas. Special attention is paid to Jekyll's lack of interest in the opposite sex, especially in his scenes with Professor Robertson. Sims Robertson is thirsty as all hell. Every single scene he's in shows him lusting after women. And Professor Robinson is really, really horny. From Susan to waitresses to, of course, Hyde herself. And honestly, it's kind of creepy. The dude seriously needs to chill out. But in every instance, Jekyll is shown to be wholly disinterested or distracted, always focusing on his work above everything else. And his work, of course, transforms into becoming Hyde. She is the only woman, other than Susan, that Jekyll shows even the slightest bit of interest in beyond simply wanting to murder them to steal their estrogen. And he only wants to do that in aid of becoming Hyde. His transgressions from heteronormative ideals of gender lead him down a path that will ultimately result in his death, but not before he's been responsible, both directly and indirectly, for the murders of countless women. And when you put it like that, oh shit. It's interesting then that Hyde, alongside leading Jekyll down the path of murder and transgression, does show a healthy appetite in sexual relationships with the opposite sex, in this case meaning men. And she's just generally far more open and sexual than Jekyll ever is. In this sense, the fact that she is interested in men is especially interesting, because of course this prompts the question, is Jekyll? And to me, there's something about this that seems to fall in line with the idea that trans women are simply just gay men struggling to come to terms with their own sexuality. And in case you were wondering if this was solely an example of Hammer just fitting the characters into their heteronormative boxes, depending on whichever gender they're identifying as, well, it's not like the studio don't have form on the queer front. In 1970, the studio produced the gothic horror The Vampire Lovers, the first in the Karnstein trilogy, with two follow-ups, 1971's Lust for a Vampire and Twins of Evil, coming out the same year as Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. On reviewing The Vampire Lovers, the New York Times called it a departure from the hackneyed bloody norm, professionally directed, opulently staged, and sexy to boot. And these are of note specifically for two reasons. The first is that all three films are notable for their exploration of overt lesbian themes and are rather explicit given the time nature. Ah, yeah. Work that candle. Work it. The second is that The Vampire Lovers was directed by Roy Ward Baker, so the decision to shy away from the more obvious queer elements present in the narrative of Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde does strike me as a little odd. Despite that, though, it is pretty impressive that the film can be as positive as it is in its depiction. That it manages to maintain this reading fairly well is a testament to the genuine skill and talent of the filmmakers, despite the problematic takes elsewhere. It would have been easy for this to descend into typically exploitative and lazy depths, but the film doesn't ever really lower itself to such cheap tactics. Instead, the film handles these ideas interestingly, and it is a legitimate shame that more isn't made of those earlier moments. Watching Jekyll discover himself as Hyde is genuinely enjoyable, and the way that the film handles what is ultimately a sensitive and complex topic is kind of admirable. Mostly. And I'd love to just stop there, but anyone who's seen the film knows that I can't, because, well, this is a horror movie and it's from the 70s. So, yeah, while it does display many, many positive interpretations, with those inevitably comes the ick factor. Of course, for all its progressiveness and supposed positive representations, I'd be remiss not to mention the obvious negative aspects of the film when viewed through this lens. Hyde, for all her beauty and brilliance, is also a maniacal murderer. She is a textbook monstrous feminine. For those of you who watched my Basic Instinct video, she could potentially be seen as falling in line with certain elements of the femme fatales that I covered there. She uses her sexuality to seduce men and lure women into a false sense of security. She is manipulative, seductive and dangerous, and like I outlined in that video, there are aspects of this that serve to paint women who fall beyond the realms of the patriarchal standard as unhinged, emotional and deadly. And this is made all the more obvious when it comes to the film's conclusion, where Hyde turns full-on villain, and it is Jekyll who sort of becomes the hero. Sure, Jekyll killed, but when he does so, it is out of his own personal perceived necessity, and he does not take pleasure in it. Hyde, meanwhile, seems to relish in the murder, and takes joy in toying with her victims. She even kills Jekyll's friend, Professor Robertson, seducing him before plunging a knife into his back, and more on that in a moment. But while this is all part and parcel of the femme fatale in horror movies, we cannot ignore the fact that Hyde is Jekyll. These are not two separate characters inhabiting one body. J.A. Simmons, a friend of Robert Louis Stevenson, upon reading the novella wrote to Stevenson saying, "Most of us, at some epoch in our lives, have been upon the verge of developing a Mr. Hyde." In Stevenson's original novella, the serum is used for purposes of living out Jekyll's own darkest impulses. So it stands to reason then that Hyde in the Hammer film does take on a certain similar role. But now we've got the gender swapping aspects to contend with. If Frankenstein appropriated Christina's body for Carl's soul, and then Carl appropriated her body to his own nefarious and vengeful ends in Frankenstein created woman, then Jekyll benefiting from the literal murder of cis women in order to make his serum is beyond appropriation. It's actively harming women so a man can transition. And that's pretty troubling. Once again, we have a male villain with predatory behaviour toward women, and this time their predatory behaviour is integral to their transition. And this element gets even more troublesome when we then throw Hyde into the mix as well. Hyde constantly uses her allure as a female and the social expectations of femininity to evade capture and lull her victims into a false sense of security. Of course, she seduces Robertson, she escapes detection by simply being female when Jekyll is under surveillance, and at one point a future victim even drops their guard after finding out that the mysterious figure stalking them in the fog is...
Oh, it's only a lady. Night, Yvonne. Night. No.
I mean, that one especially feels very turfy. If they said it in a bathroom, then, well, GCs might just explode. That Jekyll purposefully uses the femininity of Hyde to dodge suspicion, and that Hyde likewise uses her own femininity to do the same, is troublesome within the context of a trans reading. It feeds into the views and largely unsubstantiated claims of those pesky gender-critical feminists who argue that things like allowing trans women to use the ladies' loo is leading to a huge rise in crimes against cis females, including sexual assault and rape. Of course, these claims aren't evidence, but the point is that that kind of rhetoric is drawn from transphobia that is in part spurred on by films like Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. This particular aspect is interesting for both Frankenstein created women and Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. Both films show their respective female leads seducing men, and yet within the context of both films, those women are men. This is less so the case with Frankenstein created women, where the actual specifics of who is in control of Christina's body remains unclear. But when it comes to Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, it is far less ambiguous. Jekyll and Hyde are the same person, despite the muddlement over how the film chooses to present that. So everything they do is ultimately coded queer. In the film, Jekyll's relationship with women boils down to either being rude and ignorant towards Susan, being curious and liberated by Hyde, or generally just viewing every other woman as little more than an object whose very femininity itself is his for the taking. And, I know we've sort of covered this already before, but I really can't stress how icky that aspect of the film is. To begin with, Jekyll is buying the bodies of these women from Burke and Hare, who, it is implied, are murdering them for the profit they'll make from selling them. But then later he begins killing them himself. And I know I'm at risk of repeating myself once again, but it's gross. And for a film that does such a decent job at capturing the elation and freedom that comes from discovering oneself, this aspect is just made all the more worse by that fact. Moreover, when it comes to Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, that Jekyll and Hyde are using their newfound identity to prey specifically on women is also something that's troublesome and furthers the rhetoric even more. Then there's the fact that both Jekyll and Hyde stab their victims, and this is a rather overt use of imagery. The penetration of the knife entering the body suggests a certain sort of sexualization of the violence, and, well, you know who I'm going to quote here, don't you? As Carol J. Clover notes in her essay, knives and needles, like teeth, beaks, fangs and claws, are personal extensions of the body that bring attacker and attacked into primitive animalistic embrace. And this is the most negative aspect of the film. Jekyll, as a male killer, using his female alter ego as a disguise to carry out these penetrative, horrific and violent acts, especially those acts against cis women, encourages an outlook that sees trans women positioned as imposters, as perpetrators, rather than victims of male violence. And in this sense, the film is conflicted. It straddles these two readings simultaneously, and in the end it winds up on the fence, unsure of where it wants to go. Ultimately, it just sort of gives up, throwing out a lot of the established narrative and opting to actually separate Jekyll and Hyde into an obvious hero and villain respectively. In a wild leap of logic that serves only to push the narrative into its climactic showdown, Hyde decides that, in order to ensure Jekyll's transformation into her is permanent, she must kill his love interest Susan and drink her blood. Because, yeah. Of course, Jekyll takes umbrage with this, and so the stage is set for a climactic and ultimately tragic finale in which the pair fight for dominance while dangling from the outside of a building, and then they fall to the ground and die in a twisted combination of both their male and female form. And all of this in and of itself is pretty ick. I mean, the twisted, deformed face of Jekyll and Hyde mid-transformation kind of plays into the idea of trans people as freaks and monsters and all of this horrible stuff that people say about us. So, yeah, not great. As mentioned a moment ago, this part of the film is also interesting because it undoes the rest of the movie's setup. Here, they now do become entirely separate, and while Jekyll acts as the hero, Hyde becomes the villain. Jekyll works to stop Hyde's murderous scheme, and even sacrifices himself in the process. But, he is Hyde. Yeah? And herein we find an especially worrying element that I think mirrors anti-trans thinking in an interesting and telling way. By leaning into this separation of the characters late in the film, the flick essentially allows Jekyll off the hook, a man brought down by a vampish, villainous femme fatale, as opposed to a killer and a villain in his own right. There's an aspect of this that falls very much in line with the thought processes that seem to lay behind TERF rhetoric, that men are using being trans as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. If Hyde is the villain and Jekyll is in effect our hero come the film's closing moments, selflessly sacrificing himself to stop Hyde's murderous rampaging, then the movie itself seems to be asking us to forgive Jekyll of his crimes. But here's the thing, as the film itself has already illustrated on more than one occasion, despite Hyde's growing power and separation from Jekyll, the duo are the same person. They are one entity, existing within the same body. Hyde's crimes are Jekyll's as much as Jekyll's crimes are Hyde's. Bad people are bad people, regardless of whether or not they're trans, and the fact that they are trans has very little to do with it. The film's attempts to paint Jekyll not as a man brought down by his own monstrous behaviours, but rather a sort of hapless victim of a maniacal woman, reveals the undercurrent of misogyny that always runs through transphobia played out in narrative form. By having the characters so overtly inhabit the heteronormative roles of their identifying gender at any given moment, it inadvertently reveals its own sexist viewpoint. But it's nonsense. Jekyll is Hyde, Hyde is Jekyll. Both guilty, both killers. All of this just makes everything very confusing. The movie wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to both play on the transness of its premise and look at the joy in finding liberation by casting aside the patriarchal standards of heteronormativity, but then wants to punish both Jekyll and Hyde for doing so. At the same time, it also wants to paint Hyde specifically as a deadly femme fatale, the murderous and dangerous woman who has led the inherently good and proper Jekyll astray. After Jekyll first transforms into Hyde and then realises that he wants to sort of continue doing it, he kills a woman, and then this killing takes on a sort of sexual element. He does this, of course, because Burke and Hare are now out of the picture, but notably it is only after Hyde has started to take hold that Jekyll really becomes a full-blown killer, and it is only then that the kills themselves take on a sexualised aspect for him. You see cake and eat it. Jekyll is a murderous man preying on women and using femininity to lull them to a false sense of security in order to do so, but also Hyde is a separate villain that is trying to control Jekyll. Like, it's not the man that's the killer, it's the woman in the man, and, well, that's like super weird and problematic, right? Jekyll is a murderous trans character, a dangerous man preying on innocent women. But also, he is only doing this because he is driven to it by a woman who uses her seductive powers and manipulative tactics to lead him astray. It's all kinds of ick. Like, the man's the villain, but also he's only doing it because of the woman behind him, or inside of him. You get what I mean. It is Hyde who goes too far. Never mind that Jekyll knowingly engages in the murder of innocent women for his own purposes. His quest for the elixir of life is presented by the film as being almost noble, only dragged off the tracks by the seductive allure of a deadly woman, and it is she who must be punished for her crime. And that's a pretty gross takeaway. Unfortunately, it's one that pretty much undoes all of the positiveness that the film has presented so far, and also feeds into both anti-trans rhetoric and just anti-woman rhetoric in general. Ick. If there is a silver lining here, it's in the way that the film sort of highlights how both of these disgusting attitudes are born from the very same thing. Transphobia is misogyny, and they will always be interlinked. But the negative readings of the film shouldn't detract from the surprisingly progressive and fairly positive aspects outlined earlier. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde is both outdated and incredibly ahead of its time. And perhaps this is why it failed to secure Hammer's desired impact, and the studio was, eventually, left behind as the once great icon overtaken by more gritty, modern American horror. I've always been fascinated by their output, and this film is a perfect example of just why. Despite their boobs and blood approach, there's often a lot more going on behind the scenes. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty progressive. Could you imagine if they tried pulling this today? Oh wait, we don't have to. So, what have we learned? I mean, aside from the fact that TERFs are morons who will literally hate on anything if it threatens their binary worldview, even if it's something that they used to claim to love. Well, I think we've learned something about Hammer's boundary-pushing nature. The willingness to explore ideas outside of the box, as it were, to take chances and approach these classic tales in a variety of different, often somewhat progressive ways, is something that I think Hammer's new owners should take note of. For everyone tentatively celebrating the return of a great icon of British horror, it's worth remembering that they only ever became icons through their own modernising and reworking of classic tales. Sure, the sources themselves may have been somewhat old-fashioned, but it was in the studio's ability to twist these tales into something more modern, and in their controversy-baiting, somewhat progressive approach, that they were able to cement themselves as lords of horror. Moreover, It was only when they fell back on a somewhat tired formula that they found themselves struggling to keep up with other more progressive genre filmmakers. And it was in this inability to continue to be progressive in their approach that they began to see their style decline. I believe there is a space for gorgeous, melodramatic gothic horror in the classic Hammer mould here in today's modern cinematic landscape. But if it's gonna resonate with audiences, and if it's gonna make bank, then it needs to compete with everything else that's on offer. In a funny sort of way, I hope what happens with Hammer now is that John Gore and the team decide to do precisely what the studio did all those years ago with the Universal classics. Take the icons, by all means. Bring back Dracula. Bring back Frankenstein. Bring back Dr. Jekyll, but find a new spin and a modern way to tell those stories. And make sure to connect with today's movie-going audience in a way that classic Hammer were able to do in their heyday. I mean, God knows I'm down for seeing a vicious, monstrous vampire feasting on the ultra-rich. That sounds like a blast. So much emphasis is placed on the boobs and blood aspect of Hammer's classic output without people really knowing why these things worked. Both were integral to the studio's success, but both are also inherently linked to their progressive takes on old-fashioned material. Funnily enough, this new take on Dr. Jekyll, at least from what I've seen, which admittedly isn't a lot, doesn't actually seem to be about gender at all. Rather, other than the gender-swapping aspect of the title character, it seems to just be a sort of reworking of Stevenson's classic novella, and that's actually kind of disappointing. As we've outlined here, it's hardly on brand. Most of the discourse around this new film seems to be aimed almost entirely at the casting of Izzard herself, and while I do think it's pretty awesome that a trans woman is heading up what could potentially be a major genre release, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't a little bit cautious about the fact that it's her mere existence that seems to be the only thing the flick is getting noticed for. Like, really, we should all be going, oh my god, have you heard about the new Hammer film? Apparently it's crazy and wild and really subversive and interesting. Oh, and also it stars Eddie Izzard. But we're not. Nonetheless, as is always the case when we look back at film from the mystical before times, there's inevitably those worrisome elements that rear their ugly heads. To ignore those aspects is to ignore our own history and the story of how we got where we are today. And God knows ignoring our own history is never a good idea. Ultimately, we can look back on these films and see both the positives and the negatives, learn from the good bits and, most importantly, learn from the bad bits as well. I'm curious to see what this new take of Dr. Jekyll turns out to be, and I sincerely hope that it will see the studio return to its place as an icon of British horror. But I also hope that if it does so in a way that is progressive, inventive, interesting, and, well, yeah, kind of woke. Because that's what made Hammer so great in the first place, and that's what can make them great again. Thank you. Now, f*** off. Hey, so as always, thanks for watching. I'm legitimately pretty curious to see what Dr. Jekyll turns out to be. What are you folks thinking about it? And of the return of Hammer and Amicus in general? What do you hope to see from the studios in their new incarnations? And what's your fave Hammer flick? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, if you want to hear more from me, then you can head on over to my Patreon, where I have some writings and things available for just $1 a month. I'm also going to be reworking my original Amicus and Hammer history script into an essay that I'll post over there. So if you're interested in that, then yeah, that's the way to get it. Of course, if Patreon's not your thing, you can buy me a copy over on Ko-fi, and please don't forget to like, subscribe and share the channel about, so that I can reach more people and not feel so much like I'm just shouting into a void. I really appreciate it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the vid, and I'll see you all next time.